What our goal is to help young women in the Australia-China states to build their capability, confidence, and leadership skills. If you would love to join us, please follow us on LinkedIn. So I will hand over to our founder for the Center for Women's Economic Safety, Rebecca.
Hello, I'll introduce myself and tell you a little bit about the organisation that I've founded. So the Centre for Women's Economic Safety is a not-for-profit that I set up just last year, so it's kind of less than about a year old. And the intent of the organisation is to increase understanding of economic abuse and to advocate for social changes that really support women's economic safety and opportunity. And I guess the reason that I came to set up the organisation was I've been working in financial wellbeing and financial literacy for a number of years. And those two concepts are very much predicated on the idea that you can make better choices about your finances to get yourself into a better position, to increase your financial wellbeing. And of course, for women experiencing domestic and family violence, a lot of the choices and options that we talk about to improve your financial wellbeing are simply not available to you. And I got got involved with a number of initiatives and realised that there's not very much that's serving women who are experiencing economic abuse. And so the intent, our objectives are to do the advocacy, to do the education, and to connect women experiencing economic abuse or recovering from economic abuse to the supports that will help them re-establish their financial well-being. So I am joining you tonight from west of Sydney, the Darug and Gundungurra land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, but I'm delighted to be here and looking forward to talking more about this issue with you.
Thanks so much for that, Rebecca, and thank you for that wonderful acknowledgement of country. I'm coming to you here from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I too would like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'll do a little bit of a quick introduction of our fantastic speakers tonight before we get started with the panel discussion and sort of get things kicked off and underway. So we've already heard from Rebecca, and we're so thankful to have someone of her expertise and caliber joining us tonight. But we also have 4 fantastic young women here as well. So the first speaker is Grace Zhang. And Grace is an economics, regulation and policy consultant at EY, specialising in gender economics and social policy. She advises on a range of government, non-government and private sector clients on gender issues such as workplace gender equality and family violence prevention, as well as broader human services policy areas such as aged care, public health and criminal justice. Before she began her role at EY this year, Grace worked at the Department of Treasury and Finance and the Victorian Essential Services Commission, where she worked in social policy and regulatory reform. And she graduated from the University of Melbourne with a Bachelor of Arts, majoring in Gender Studies and Economics. So tonight's discussion is right up her alley. We also have the lovely Dia John joining us. So Dia is a finance and economics student, also at the University of Melbourne, and she's also doing a Diploma of Languages in Arabic on the side as well. So this year, she's currently an OECD Australian delegate, and she's an incoming investment banking analyst at Macquarie Capital as well. In terms of her other financial background, she was the Vice President of the Finance Students Association, and she was a University of Melbourne project consultant for a Peruvian startup. Earlier this year, she also represented the university at the world's largest case competition in Montreal, and she's very passionate about social impact, especially greater economic engagement among youth and women. She was previously the 2016 delegate to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women in New York. So we're really excited to have Dia joining us here today. Last two, but certainly not least, we have Angela joining us, who is one of the co-founders of Veda Melbourne. And Angela is a third-year economics, politics and German student. She's undertaken sponsorship and event management roles as part of 2 student societies, both the Economics Student Society of Australia and Banking on Women. And she enjoys playing the piano and hopes to someday visit Yosemite National Park once borders finally open. And lastly, we have Caitlyn Fleming, who is an economics and finance student. She currently empowers young women through involvement in her high school's alumni board, and is the co-president of Banking on Women. In her spare time, she likes to eat her way through Melbourne when cafes and restaurants are open, and also go on some nice long walks. And lastly, my name is Deborah. I am the National People to People Director at ACYA, so the Australia China Youth Association. Outside of my role with ACYA, I currently am a secondary teacher candidate at the University of Melbourne. And one of the areas in which I specialise in is commerce. So I'm really passionate about helping young people, and particularly young women, be empowered in terms of their financial decision making. All right, I'll stop sharing the screen now. Great to see some introductions happening in the chat, and I encourage you to keep on going with them. But I guess I'll kick off this panel discussion with a question to you, Rebecca. I guess when people think of domestic violence, they often think of things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, and verbal abuse. But economic or financial abuse is something that not a lot of people know about, including myself, before I began to do some research on this particular webinar. What is economic abuse, and what are some ways in which it occurs?
Sure, and that's really common, because economic abuse is a lot more invisible, but it does often occur alongside physical, psychological, emotional, and sexual abuse. And it's when an abuser attempts to control their partner's ability to acquire, use, or maintain money or economic resources, and in so doing, threaten or undermine a person's financial independence and security. So it can look like an awful lot of different things. Some of those things might not even seem from the outside like they are abusive behaviours. But we talk generally about three different kinds of categories of behaviours that tend to make up financial abuse. So you have controlling behaviours like controlling a partner's access to cash or bank accounts, not providing them with enough money for basic necessities, or hiding financial information and assets. A second category of financial abuse is exploitation type behaviours. So this is where a partner is running up debt in their partner's names, perhaps refusing to contribute to household bills, or even forcing a partner to work in a family business without pay or legal employment conditions. And then the third sort of general category of financial abuse is what we call sabotage. So that's often where you see a partner not letting their partner work or study, or actually actively sabotaging their performance, perhaps by keeping them up all night before they're due at work, perhaps for a big presentation. There have been instances of hiding the car keys when someone relies on a car to get to work. So that kind of sabotaging behaviour. And the other form of sabotage you sometimes see is using systems to create costs for someone. So you often see that in a post-separation scenario where one party is taking the other one through the legal system, delaying and costing them more and more money through the legal system. Or it could be something as simple as damaging someone's property and causing them costs that way. In terms of how it can happen, Deborah, it can start really subtly. In fact, it can start by looking like a partner who cares for you and wants to take care of you. So it might be, look, I know you've got a lot on your plate, so why don't I take care of the money? I'll manage the money. It could be the start of financial abuse, or it could genuinely be a caring partner taking the load off. So that's why it's so hard for us to recognise and talk about. We can't make assumptions that because some of these things are happening that abuse is therefore occurring. However, it could be. So we'll often hear stories of people who say, well, actually all of the bills were in my name because of this reason, or because of that reason, or because they were on a holiday visa or whatnot. So it's very, very common in domestic and family violence situations. Upwards of 90% of people experiencing domestic violence will also be experiencing economic abuse.
One of the things you mentioned, which was particularly pertinent, was that often financial abuse is invisible or very hard to detect. If you do suspect that either yourself or someone you know is undergoing financial abuse or is at risk of financial abuse, what can we do as potentially friends or family members?
So I think so if it's yourself that is concerned, I think there are a number of sort of questions you can ask yourself is, what don't I know? And if I ask questions about that in relation to finances, do I get an answer? And if you don't get an answer, you get the runaround. It's a lot of secrecy, and you realize that you actually don't want to probe anymore because you're fearful. That's a pretty good sign to yourself that something's not right. And I think for people experiencing it, they can trust their instinct that something's not right, even if they don't have a way to verbalize that yet. For friends and family and colleagues, I think it's really difficult. I mentioned earlier that there are some things which might be happening which could be abuse, but they might not be. So, but some of the warning signs, some of the things that I'd be tuned into are, is my friend always saying I can't go out, or I can't afford to go out, or not wanting to meet for coffee, or something that's going to involve money? Or perhaps they're very anxious about the money they've spent or something they've just done. There seems to be fearful about the consequences if their partner finds out something that's just happened. Or perhaps they'll even be a little bit more open. They'll talk about there's arguments with their partner. Again, none of these things might be abuse, but they might be. And I guess as a friend or a family member, a colleague, I think the thing is be alert to that. If it's very important when people are experiencing abuse that they know that there are people they can reach out to and trust. And so I'd just be there for them. And maybe it's about saying, look, let's not get a coffee, let's go for a walk. So being able to offer options in terms of the time and the place that you might spend time with that person that give them some more possibilities if money is tight or a problem, or in fact there is economic abuse going on. And obviously if someone does decide to disclose to you that something is happening, that's a very, very big moment. And the first thing is not to solve their problems, but just to be there for them and to listen, to believe, and that they know that you're there for them. That's a very powerful social response in and of itself. You don't have to go into problem solving mode, but it'll mean the world that they know someone knows and believes them.
Thanks so much for that response, Rebecca. That was incredibly comprehensive and I'm sure very enlightening for a lot of the members here with us today. Grace, I might direct the next question to you. So you majored in gender studies and economics at university, and now you work in gender economics and policy. Are you able to elaborate a little bit on how you became interested in this intersection and why women are particularly susceptible to financial abuse?
Yeah, thanks so much, Deborah. So I think for me, gender and economics is just a really natural partnership, and there's just a lot that makes sense in this combination. So in terms of gender studies, that was always a big part of who I am, my beliefs in feminism, my beliefs in structural disadvantage, and critical theory. So that always made a lot of sense to me. And then in terms of economics, I always found it really interesting, not just sort of in terms of the numbers and the figures, but really for me, economics is a way of understanding the world. It's a framework and it's a language that we can use to sort of explain how the world works. And so in that sense, it's really quite similar to gender studies, and it's really quite similar to a lot of these sort of sociological fields. And in that sense, there's a lot of really natural synergies there. So that's really become evident in my work as a consultant, and working with governments, working with private corporations. These synergies have really come to light. So firstly, in terms of economics as an area of disadvantage for women, it really is one of the most pertinent structural areas of disadvantage for women. So being able to understand what economic disadvantage actually means, being able to interpret those numbers and being able to sort of tell the big picture story about them by using gender theory as well as economic theory, I think has been a really big advantage for me in my work. And also I just think it's such a useful thing because economics is the language that at the end of the day, that's the language that governments speak, that policymakers speak, and that a lot of corporations speak. And we really need to get all these organizations on board if we want to advance women's economic empowerment and fight against all forms of structural disadvantage. It's really important that we can understand the incentives of governments and policymakers, and then we can align those incentives with measures and policies that really empower women and all sorts of minorities. So I think, you know, I have had a lot of people say to me, oh, gender studies and economics, that's such an interesting combination. Oh, that's such a, you know, unique combination. But I think it's only unique because we've been really socialized to understand economics as this area that's dominated by men and that's about making money, when it really isn't. It's just an incredibly useful tool that we can all use to empower not just women, not just gender minorities, but minorities in terms of race and class and sexuality. So yeah, I'm really, really happy and really glad to be in this field.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Grace. One of the things you've also mentioned to me, I guess, outside of our conversations here, is that you're really passionate about people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. What kind of impact does things like cultural background, linguistic diversity, and immigration status have on things like family violence and financial abuse?
Yeah, I think it's just, there's a massive impact there. I think firstly, it's becoming more and more understood the importance of intersectionality. And, you know, maybe a few years ago, that was something of a buzzword that was not very well understood. But now we're seeing it become more and more embedded into core aspects of the policy landscape. So the Royal Commission into Family Violence, the Free from Violence, Family Violence Prevention Strategy that we've seen in Victoria have all acknowledged race and cultural and linguistic diversity as an intersecting factor in structural disadvantage. So I think that just speaks to how important that's become. In terms of family violence and the impact in particular, I think it happens on a few levels. So firstly, on the individual level, your ethnicity and your cultural background, and even, you know, whether you experience linguistic diversity, that has a massive impact on a lot of the risk factors when it comes to family violence and financial abuse. So some of these risk factors we speak about are things like gender roles, you know, whether women work in the first place, what kind of work women are socialized into, the gender pay gap, the fact that that is a function of socialization, things like whether women have access to their own income, a lot of the stuff that Rebecca was speaking about earlier, you know, just examples that are all built around your culture and your personal background, even things like who's paying the bills and what, you know, which name in a partnership, whether that's under a woman's name or not, that can result in a lot of debt being, you know, saddled upon women. So all these gender roles are deeply informed by cultural background. But there's a lot more than that as well in terms of immigrant status. I think just comparing my mum's experience to my own, so she was first generation immigrant, I'm a second generation immigrant, just comparing the amount of information and support that I have access to as a fluent speaker of English versus, you know, what she had access to 20 years ago, there's just a world apart. So I think what these things really speak to is the importance of policy that really targets and understands and appreciates cultural and linguistic diversity. So on a prevention level, in terms of targeting gender roles, there's no use targeting gender roles without understanding how culture impacts gender roles. There's no use targeting gender roles in general without understanding, you know, the experience of minority women and immigrant women and how those gender roles are different. And these women simply are just often a lot more vulnerable in a lot of other ways. You know, immigrant women or women from cultural and linguistically diverse backgrounds often have less access to the kind of informal support networks of family and friends that become really, really important when it comes to responding to family violence. When you're seeking support, you know, if there is an instance of family violence, that support needs to be tailored. It cannot be one size fit all. It, you know, needs to be more than just, you know, an information sheet that's offered in English online. It has to be, you know, we have to involve linguistic diversity, we have to involve translators, but it also needs to be culturally appropriate. It needs to understand that sometimes the kind of solutions that are available to, you know, non-immigrant women are different to the solutions that are required for immigrant women. So I think what this all speaks to is that family violence is just about a whole lot of different systems that intersect, and it's personal, but it's also political, it's system-based. And so, you know, to really solve this problem, this massive problem, being able to empower women financially is really, really important, but we have to do that in a way that acknowledges all intersections of disadvantage that women are facing. And it's also really just one piece of the puzzle, because whilst, you know, personal finance and empowering women financially is so, so important, and it's so, so crucial, it's one piece of the puzzle, and the broader sort of family violence policy landscape will take this massive system overhaul. So it's a really good thing to be a part of this webinar today, to see us all take this crucial step that is just such an important part of the overall puzzle in combating family violence and financial abuse.
Thanks so much for that, Grace. That was incredibly insightful. I might direct my next question to Andrew and Caitlyn, who are the co-founders of Veda, which is a Melbourne-based financial literacy social enterprise. So Andrew and Caitlyn, what inspired you to start Veda and go into this field of financial literacy, particularly targeting young women?
Yeah, so thank you so much for your question, Deborah, and thanks so much for offering to have us as part of this webinar tonight. Caitlyn and I have been so excited over the last week to answer all of the questions as part of the panel and to run a mini workshop for everyone attending this event tonight. So thank you so much. So for us, you know, after watching our dads sort of dominate the household finances and watching our friends struggle with handling their money woes, you know, these are friends that are, you know, competent in finance and economics. You know, they were struggling to understand some of the most basic concepts. So we formed Veda to really kickstart our own financial independence and also share our skills and knowledge with other women far and wide. So from the outset, I want to make really clear that what we do at Veda has never been about excluding men from the conversation of personal finance. So when we find that financial stress is the primary cause of relationship breakdown in Australia, what we try and do is incentivize young women to take control of their finances from a young age so that they're always on the same page with their partners and they don't fall victim to troubling circumstances such as financial abuse, which affect twice as many women as they do men, according to a journal in the Australian New Zealand Journal of Public Health. So we hope that, you know, with our workshops, you know, young men will be equally compelled to learn from their partners and put just as much faith in their financial decisions as so many young women often do. So Veda was sort of Caitlyn and I's little brainchild. You know, we both found ourselves in sort of a banking, commerce, student society without any knowledge about how we were going to grow our wealth and sort of in this search for economic empowerment, despite being in society as student societies or around people who wanted to pursue high-flying careers in the business and corporate finance sector. At the time, I was actually really interested and obsessed with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And in particular, she often said in interviews, you know, her mother always used to say, be a lady, but also be independent. So even if you happen to marry Prince Charming, always learn to fend for yourself. Financial literacy is central to our independence. When we're financially literate, and I don't just mean planning a budget, knowing every nook and cranny of our money ecosystem, from super to investing to real estate and back to tax, back to front, inside out, then only then can we take full ownership of the decisions that we make rather than delegate them to someone else. So knowing that we have full control over the choices that we make, and most importantly, are in a secure enough position to make the best choices to live our most fulfilling lives, are the central principles that guide Veda's philosophy, which is a commitment to building the next generation of financially confident, capable, and courageous young women. Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks so much for that intro, Angela. I'm really excited to hear from you in a very short while as well about some basics of investing and super. Caitlyn, I might direct this one to you quite quickly. I know you guys have a lot of fantastic resources available on your social media, for example, your Facebook and Instagram page. But what should young women seeking financial independence be researching and reading up on as a very basic starter point?
Yeah, so the first thing I want to say is financial literacy doesn't have to be super fancy or technical. Like, you don't have to become an accountant or an investment banker overnight. You just got to wrap your head around the core concepts that really count. So the OECD's core financial literacy concepts are just inflation, diversification, and compound interest. which doesn't sound too bad, just those 3 concepts. But at Veda, we have sort of a 4-step recommendation. So I suggest first that you understand why being financially literate is important, and you guys are coming to this event today, so that's good. And to keep that as sort of a motivation for you to stay on top of your money game. And then I suggest you get on top of the basics like budgeting, what interest rates are, and how debit cards work. And then start researching how to grow your money. So I'm talking about like the time value of money, understanding how the share market works, and why ETFs are so powerful. And then I suggest, moving on to the more adult topics like super, tax, and HEX. So if you follow the Veda Instagram, which I did link in the Zoom just before, or the Facebook page or the website, you'll get some crash courses on these topics. So just really bite-sized pieces, none of the fluff, just the core concepts you need to get your head around. And that's all you really need to know.
Amazing. Thanks so much for that, Caitlin. I've popped a link as well in the chat. So if anyone is an Instagram user and is interested in checking it out, there is a link there for you. I'll direct our last couple of questions to Dia then before we jump straight into the Veda workshop. Dia, obviously you've been doing some amazing work this year as an OECD delegate and as a founder as yourself of your own youth-led policy initiative. What role do you believe young people in particular play in ensuring women's economic independence and financial literacy?
Thanks, Deborah, and that was a very generous introduction. I'll touch quickly on young people's economic empowerment and financial literacy more generally, and then focus specifically on young women and the role young people can play in this issue. So just taking a bird's eye view, empirically speaking, Australian youth in general aren't as financially literate enough to navigate the system and the financial products that are out there that they can use with enough ease. In fact, research according to, I'm not sure if you're all aware of something called HILDA, the Household Income and Labor Dynamics Survey, shows that a quarter of young Australians, less than a quarter, really really have basic to insubstantial levels of financial literacy. Or 3/4 have that much basic levels of financial literacy, whereas less than a quarter would say that they can navigate the system with ease. And that COVID-19 as a reality doesn't really complement that statistic really well, because it is young people who don't have their own houses. It is young people who have to pay private rent, especially if you're an international student at this time. It is young people who are precariously employed in the gig economy or as casual workers. And it is young people that work in the most hard-hit sectors by COVID-19, such as hospitality and retail. And what's interesting is that the statistics aren't great with young people, but if we scrutinize those figures even further, the numbers concerning youth financial literacy show that young females specifically tend to fare worse than their male counterparts, even after accounting for things such as education level, income, or socioeconomic differences. So though young people, empirically speaking, are more likely to have qualities that could lead them to, or have this proclivity to budget or save, there is a deep lack of awareness amongst females of how to do that and of the financial products that are in the market. Financial products such as a loan, a mortgage, saving. What is the power of compounding? How do I, what is the practical implication of compounding more than just learning it in my maths classroom in year 9, and engaging with the latest financial innovations? That is something that women systematically seem to lack, and culturally also there seems to be a huge gap. So coming now to, are we seeing attitudes change? Are we seeing norms change? Sure. Is it changing at a good enough rate, and can we be satisfied with the amount of change? Absolutely not. There is so much yet to be, so much to be done, especially when we live in a COVID world where more women than men work in casual jobs, and so more women have missed out on JobKeeper payments than men. Or we have a superannuation system where you get paid annual leave and you get long service leave, yet you don't get maternal leave. And a lot of women leave the workforce, even temporarily, because of caring responsibilities, and that doesn't go to their super. So we live in a system and with a budget that isn't necessarily catering to women's needs. And so finally coming back to that question of what can young people do? And I know I've painted a pretty bleak reality that isn't meant to be off-putting, but I just want to reinforce how much youth can provide a fresh perspective to this. And I think it's collaborative, not necessarily young people's responsibility in order to work to solving an issue like this. From a youth perspective, I think the difficulties that young women face with regard to financial literacy can be overcome with very simple things such as engaging with organizations such as Veda. I know I can sing the chat. I see so many people already up on their Instagram page, which is so worth it. Financial literacy can be so simple, but being able to apply it is absolutely so different to the theory of it. So supporting organizations like that and learning how to practically deal with finances, including CWES as well, Rebecca CWES, I think is so critical. But also taking a step further, I think lobbying for a lot of discourse and action around financial well-being from a really young age, from a school/household age, is also really important. And I'll tell you why. There was a survey conducted, I think, of over 1,000 Australian or American, I'm not sure, sorry, households that observed the way parents deal with financial conversations with their daughters or sons. And when it came to their sons, the conversations encompassed things such as growing your financial wealth or investing. Whereas when it came to daughters, it was more so how to budget, how to be financially conservative or restrain your finances. So I think even rephrasing simple things such as that from a household, even if from a young age, makes a big difference in terms of the norms and attitudes that we form. And I think, you know, at high school, we're expected to have a basic level of English literacy, numeracy literacy, scientific literacy. So I think civic and personal finance literacy is something that is well overdue. And yeah, we got to learn, as Joe Biden said yesterday in its presidential debate, how to walk and chew gum at the same time. So it's not good enough to just report these things, but we have to be able to walk the talk as well and apply these things, which can be very basic to apply actually.
Thanks so much, Dea. Many young women seeking financial independence often feel really discouraged, though, due to things like a lack of intergenerational wealth in their families, and as Grace mentioned earlier, that lack of intergenerational knowledge. To what extent is this a barrier to financial freedom, and how might we overcome things like not having parents or grandparents who seem to be really smart with their money?
Absolutely. And this is such an interesting question, and one that I think is particularly relevant to my life. I think Grace and Rebecca covered it really well in terms of the numbers, in terms of defining things, which I think is crucial in terms of understanding an issue. You need to know what the issue is. But the more I talk to friends and family, especially from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds or CAL backgrounds, this seems to be a very pervasive issue. The intergenerational impacts of financial or economic abuse. So to a question like this, I can't offer all the statistics and reports out there, but I hope what I can adequately do is share my story and experiences with intergenerational consequences of financial or economic abuse. So to keep a very long story that expands over 7 to 8 years, I'll keep it very short, but I'll start off with my migration story. So my family migrated to Australia from the Middle East around 5 to 6 years ago. And you know, from the get-go, that wasn't a unanimous decision because it was mainly due to my father's employment opportunities that he had here in Australia that we moved. And my father and mother actually have very comparable skills and training in dentistry. Almost very similar skills, yet a lot of the funding and resources to requalify as a dentist was pumped in for my father's economic well-being. So, and for those of you who don't know, having your medical qualification accepted in Australia from a foreign country is very, very long and expensive. So my father did pass the exams, and a lot of household resources were pumped into that. My mother literally had to come here with virtually no recognized degree, and still to this very date, she hasn't written her exam. My mother will never be able to practice again in her, what she calls her vocation, her first love, which is dentistry. So there were even periods of time after coming to Australia when my father had to work overseas. And to say the least, that wasn't convenient because and these were really the telltale signs of economic abuse that Rebecca and Grace sort of spelled out here, but that I didn't even know was a thing, such as lack of transparency regarding financial decisions made by my father overseas. My mom was unemployed and overqualified for anything she applied for. We lived in a zero-income household for a very long time, quite a few years. And as terrible as it was for my mother, it also naturally had its impacts on me and my sister. And you might be in a terrible economically abusive relationship yourself, or you might be impacted by it because someone else is in such a relationship. And it can mean things like making sure every penny counts, making sure that every coffee that you buy, you got to work out the opportunity cost. It meant days of sleeping in the car because we weren't used to the Melbourne winter and it was too expensive to turn on the heater. It meant, missing out on gatherings or social things, which at high school was, a very big part of being in high school. It meant taking up a job in hospitality, having to work early hours into the day and then take public transport back home. All because I was happy to support my mom, but that doesn't excuse the fact that it wasn't convenient. So that is my story, but I guess you all might be going through things or might have gone through things or know people going through similar things. So how can you actually cope with this? And these are the things that reports and numbers can't always capture. Physically, you are inhibited. Financially, without that freedom, everything has a cost. Every penny counts. And this is also inextricably linked to your psychology and emotional pressure. It could be lack of focus in your study or work. It could be lack of sleep, anxiety, mental health issues, and the added pressure of making everything count because every single penny counts. And it really doesn't help being a culturally or linguistically diverse woman, as a migrant, as a refugee, as an asylum seeker, people without permanent visas. You're always typecast already as not too Australian enough or not having long established community or support, as we've heard today. But a big cultural barrier is also money. Money is seen, and I come from an Indian background, as a private matter, and therefore economic abuse is seen as a taboo to share with other people. And I'll quickly wrap up because I know I'm going a bit over time, but this gets me riled up. I think that I am in no position to give you any financial assistance or professional advice at all, but here are a few services that I really think benefited me, as well as benefited a few of my friends who've been going through the same thing. So just quickly, if you're a permanent resident, you have access to Medicare, through which you can access 10 free sessions annually with a psychologist or a psychiatrist. It helps being able to talk to a third party that isn't your mom or your dad or someone close to you. Centerlink Youth Allowance is available for people aged 18 to 24. There's the 1-800-RESPECT, which is the national mental health helpline. And there's also a Centerlink claim for crisis payment, which if you're in an extreme domestic violence situation, you can claim that money. And even if you're not a permanent citizen with access to Centerlink, there are services such as Good Shepherd Microfinance or Speckle, where they give you flexible microfinance loans. Money Smart is a good, good tool, and I'm sure your university or workplace might have psychological support services. So, sorry for the massive rant, but it has debilitating impacts on everyone involved in the equation when it comes to economic abuse. And having community and reaching out to the right resources is key.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Dia. I'm sure I speak on behalf of all the attendees here to say that was incredibly powerful. And thank you again for sharing those resources at the end. I'm sure that will definitely impact or benefit many members here today as well. Cool. So just to wrap up for tonight, in terms of where to next, as has previously been mentioned by both Rebecca and the founders at Veda, we do have some resources for you that will be shared by email. So that's the 2 PDFs on super and investing basics, as well as some fantastic resources from Rebecca about resources you can access if you're worried about financial abuse or someone you know may be at risk. We'd also really encourage you to check out Veda and CWES on social media. So cwes.org.au and vedamelb.com. Veda has a fantastic Instagram, which has some great plain English financial literacy tips. And the Centre for Women's Economic Safety has an equally fantastic Facebook page that posts very interesting and very relevant news updates and policy updates from the Australian space. If you'd like to stay in contact with the ACYA Women's Network, we'd also love for that to happen as well. We host these webinars every month and the focus is on different aspects of women's empowerment and learning. So if you'd like to upskill and engage with some like-minded women in the Australia-China space, this is definitely the organisation for you. We have a really quick feedback survey if you'd like to share your thoughts on this webinar. Otherwise, if you'd like to keep on engaging with us, we're active on Facebook. We do have a very active LinkedIn page as well, which Sally mentioned earlier. And then if you'd like to be part of our WeChat group for the Acya Women's Network, just simply add our wonderful director, Sally, on WeChat at ACEL's Delegates. These details will all be shared in the email as well, and then she'll be able to add you into the group chat. That is all from me today. But I'd just like to say a massive thank you to everyone again. I hope you all learned something and enjoy the rest of your evening.